If Russia can just forcibly take land, won't that just set a dangerous precedent? And we'll be living in a world where the most powerful guy on the block can just gobble up its neighbors, and that's what we want to stop. We would descend into chaos if we don't,
Right.
respect the borders, the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Right. Well, it's actually clear again that Russia was looking to avoid, the acquisition of territory. It's always the SMO and the annexation of Crimea. They're always portrayed as just like this very aggressive actions. But from the Russian point of view, there were defensive actions that were taken as a last resort, and there had been.
How can we say invading a country is a defensive action?
Okay, well, in the case of, we'll start off with Crimea, because that's the first, that was the first, let's say, territorial acquisition. And that happened in 2014 following the coup. Well, there was a coup, because this was seen as a very aggressive action on part of the West. And again, Crimea was always kind of a special case. There was even before the fall of the Soviet Union, there were discussions as they're saying, okay, yeah, we're going to split up, or initially it wasn't going to be a complete split up. We're going to just, according to Gorbachev, devolve powers to the various republics. We're going to have a federal system. But many were arguing at that time, it's like, Crimea really should not be considered part of Ukraine. It was actually attached to Ukraine, and I believe it was 1954 or 1956 by Khrushchev. And it was, at that point, it was somewhat controversial then. Khrushchev himself was Ukrainian, by the way. But it wasn't that big a deal because it was all within the Soviet Union. But then afterwards, it was like, well, wait a second, this is now going to become part of Ukraine. This thing that was kind of this transfer that was made is almost, in very bureaucratic and kind of an arbitrary fashion. And the people there are just overwhelmingly identify and want to be a part of Russia. Like prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, you look in early 1990s, some polls showed that something like 90% of the people wanted to be part of Russia. So there were moves back then to say, okay, yeah, we'll devolve powers to these republics, but let's make sure that Crimea is actually within the Russian Federation, or is a part of Russia. So it was always a very special case, and then when the coup broke out again, which was a very, I think, properly understood, it was certainly perceived as a very aggressive action, and that was supported. I think it's not fair to say that that the CIA carried it out. I think it really was the ultranationalists in the square that did it, but it was supported by the U.S. The U.S. had been pumping money in. Victoria Nuland said, oh yeah, we spent $5 billion here in Ukraine, to put them on this track. The EU admitted to 500 million euros. It was probably more than that. And we had them, like during the Maidan protests, we had various political figures from the West, most famously Victoria Nuland passing out the cookies. But we also had John McCain actually up on the stage with one of these ultranationalist, kind of neo-Nazi Banderites, typical. He also showed up with some head choppers in the Middle East. That's where he seems to gravitate to these kind of people. And so Russia saw this is how they perceived it, with a great deal of justification, that this was a Western-sponsored, aggressive, coup, a takeover of this duly elected government. And, not only did they fear for Crimea, well, Crimea was also, explained its unusual history there, but it's also just vital to Russia's own defense. They had Sevastopol, which is the by far the largest Black Sea, naval base. Is really, which again, Russia's a very large country, but it just has very, very few, naval bases, because it doesn't, right. It just doesn't have the the warm water ports, exactly. And this was one of them, and probably the most important of all. And there was a fear, again, it was a legitimate fear, I think, that it was going to be seized by the Ukrainians and then by NATO. Because this, behind all of this, I think you have to remember, it's not just what happened in Ukraine. There's a larger context, and that is the eastward expansion of NATO. Again, going all the way back, 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall, a promise was made, and this later was documented. There was efforts to deny it, but it was clearly documented by the Americans and by other Western Europeans, that NATO will not expand eastward. Even had the word not an inch eastward. And it was on that understanding that the Russians, allowed this to happen and withdrew their forces from all of Eastern Europe because they had this promise, that was made to them. Well, that promise was broken, starting in the late 90s, that country after country, was added to NATO. NATO began expanding eastward. And then in 2008, at the United States, NATO declared, really under pressure from the U.S. The Europeans at that time were reluctant. They said this is not a good idea, but the NATO ended up declaring under U.S. pressure that Ukraine would be put on the NATO track, would become a member of NATO along with Georgia. Now, this was very, very alarming, again, to the Russians. Now, I know there's this claim that, we're purely defensive, but the Russians had seen what had happened in Serbia. Later, they saw what happened in Libya and said, this is not a defensive organization. This can be very aggressive, and they're aiming to be right on our borders, take control of our most vital warm water port. So from the Russian point of view, this is very defensive. And the thing is that they didn't just do this right away, immediately, they even going back even earlier, because they knew that there was talk about making Ukraine part of NATO. They were letting it be known again and again, hey, this is something that we just cannot tolerate. This is really a red line for us. We cannot let this happen. And the Americans knew it, and the Europeans knew it. They chose to ignore it. There's a very famous memo that came from Bill Burns, who was the ambassador to Russia back in the early 2000s, later became the head of the CIA under Biden. The memo is titled or is known as "Niet" means "Niet." It's just like you said in that, look, the Russians are really serious about this. It's not just Putin. It's just they are very worried about Ukraine, and this could mean war. This was understood. And the Russians were warning. It's not like they just jumped the gun and surprised us. They were telling us again and again, hey, this is just something we cannot tolerate. But I think, again, just coming out of the 90s, for such a long time, Russia had been so weak that we'd learned to ignore them. And we decided just, who cares what the Russians think? Who cares? Well, eventually the Russians responded. Eventually, after, just this long history of disregarding their vital security interests. Now, let's go back a little bit farther. You say, well, why should the Russians be worried about this? It's because, Russia in 1941 was invaded by Nazi Germany and Operation Barbarossa. That led to the deaths of 27 million Russians. I mean, this is just such an astronomical figure that we can't even really begin to understand what that meant to them. We remember our 500,000 fallen, but it's just nothing. And it was a war that not only, led to deaths of so many Russians, just devastated so much of Russia. So there's a real fear. Now you have these ultranationalists that are using that just like the same, they seem like the same old people, in a way they really are. And there's a historical link between them, between the ones that attacked them in 1941 and these new Banderites in Ukraine. And they're using the same sort of, anti-Russian language, and they have just overthrown the government, and they're talking about they want to get, get that base in Sevastopol. You're just saying, if you say, well, I don't understand why they're so nervous, I don't think you're making an effort to really put yourself in the Russian shoes. And there's a real fear there, based on history, based on the behavior of NATO over the last, the years leading up to the coup itself. So, from the Russian point of view, it's defensive. They're again, we never make any effort to understand what they're saying, and we don't pay attention to anything they say. If we had, we wouldn't have been surprised, right? But the public is never told about this, so it just seems to come out of the blue. It just seems like a very aggressive Russian action.
Okay, well, could we say at least there's some, legal arguments, for example, like the Budapest Memorandum? Ukraine had nuclear weapons and it gave them up and returned them to Russia in exchange for security guarantees, in exchange for the promise that their sovereignty would not be violated, that they would not be invaded precisely by someone like Russia. What do you say to something like that?
Yeah, well, but there was also other promises that were made on the Ukrainian side, and that was neutrality and also, protection of minorities. And so those were violated by the Ukrainian side. So the Russians looking at it say that you've already violated this memorandum. This doesn't hold anymore. And I think there's no question, if the Ukrainians had agreed to neutrality and the previous government, the one that was overthrown, had, but clearly the new one that was being put in with NATO support, EU and CIA support, it was hot to join NATO and to violate its neutrality. And in the end, well, they did. They after the coup, the Ukrainians changed their constitution and ceased to be a neutral country in preparation for becoming a NATO country. So they did end up by violating the Budapest Memorandum before the Russians did.
Okay, well, even if, let's say, there's provocations towards the Russians, they saw this as a threat. Okay, they invaded. What about just the horrific war crimes that we see? We hear about the Bucha massacre, Mariupol, Kharkiv. If you're listening to Western media, you see this, what's being shown as deliberate targeting of schools and hospitals, civilian infrastructure. No matter what, you can't justify that, right?
Yeah, but this clearly there's not deliberate targeting. I mean, you stop and think about it, it's actually extraordinary how careful the Russians have been and how few civilian casualties there have been. Look, over the course of 3 years, there have been, I don't know how many tens of thousands of drones and thousands of missiles fired in. Recently, over the last summer and up to now, just the other night, what did we have? 500 drones and 60 missiles. And this is becoming normal. And the thing is that most of the time, there are no casualties. Occasionally, there's 1, 2, 3 people killed, which is, I'm not going to minimize. But actually, you think about it, that this is a testament to the restraint, the caution, the precision of these strikes. Now, over the course of months and months and months, occasionally something will go wrong. And it's not clear that it's gone wrong on the Russian side. But inevitably, there's going to be a missile that goes off course and hits something. Now, you're just telling me we know that they're hitting these energy facilities, these military production sites, with these training sites, and so on and forth. All these things that have clear military value. It happens night after night after night over the course of, of years. What you're telling me to believe is that every once in a while you say, let's just strike a hospital. We're going to send this missile and hit the children's cancer ward or something. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. The other explanation, which is, I think in the end, you just have to say, has to be true, because if you're firing so many missiles and so many drones, again, it's just inevitable that some of these are going to go off course for one reason or another, and something's going to be hit. It's just going to happen statistically. It's going to happen. So it does happen occasionally, every few months that maybe a hospital is hit or a residential structure is hit and there are a few civilians that are killed. But what happened? There are different things. It could be that the missile or the drone malfunctioned. That's possible, because occasionally they will. But then you have to also remember that Ukraine has air defense. They're sending up their own missiles, and sometimes they succeed in intercepting. Often they do, and the missile blows up, but then fragments fall. But other times, they're only partially successful, and they can knock a missile off course. Or sometimes the interceptor misses the incoming missile or drone entirely and lands within the city and strikes a target. That's just going to happen. You can't tell me it's not going to happen. And if you just look at it, that's what you're going to expect. That's a kind of collateral damage. There's no reason to go for this targeting argument. It just doesn't make a bit of sense, and it's just not supported by the statistics. Again, it's extraordinary how few civilian casualties have occurred. And at this point, I just want to make one little point. I saw a statistic. This was in Haaretz, not a pro-Russian newspaper by any account. But they said, within Gaza, the 46% of those killed by the IDF were women and children, which is double, actually, like the historical average, twice as much as the second highest toll in a war, during the last many decades. But in Russia, it's only 1%. In Ukraine, rather, by the Russians. They have been extraordinarily careful.
I think it's higher probably in Gaza.
It probably is. But even the official, like what the IDF, has recognized, at least, among themselves, and has been leaked to Haaretz, we have 46%, which is very, very high. We're not talking about other civilians, just women and children.
Right. Yeah. I saw BBC a while ago had a 65% or something like that.
Right.
But anyways, we'll stick on Ukraine. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, I understand. Okay, things can go wrong with air defense and missiles and drones. But what about, how would you explain the massacres that were committed? Bucha, Mariupol, Kharkiv.
Okay. Well, I would say they didn't occur. I mean, there was the one that I know about is the so-called Bucha massacre, and there may have been a massacre, but if it happened, it was most likely carried out by the ultranationalists against Russian sympathizers. Again, well, one thing, like the Russians withdrew from the town. We didn't hear anything about it. We just got some sort of happy message from the mayor. And it wasn't until 4 days later that these claims were made, which again is very odd. And then we had pictures, people came and took pictures of people lying dead in the streets 4 days later. And one thing is they noticed that a lot of these bodies had, there was some sort of, I can't remember the color, if it was orange or something, that they had a ribbon, like tied around the arm. And that was something that actually, that residents had used to identify themselves as pro-Russian, or who actually helped out the Russians when they came into the town. And so a lot of people have argued, and there's more evidence to support it. I haven't gone into really, but there are transmissions and so on and so forth, that it was the ultranationalists who came in and later killed the Russian sympathizers. Now, I know there has been some evidence, actually, that's more than just claims of the Ukrainian government, that there were some civilians killed by the Russian soldiers. And again, these were actually, they say there were civilians had organized like their own militias, and the Russian soldiers did kill some of them. But we're talking about something very small scale, not a major massacre. Again, like the Russians themselves had said, hey, let's actually have an investigation. Give us the names of these people that you claim are our victims. Okay, there was never any kind of proper investigation, the international investigation carried out, and they never have, to this day, refused to release the names. So I think there's every reason to believe that this was a false flag. Now, why would they do a false flag? Or it was actually a cover-up of a massacre that was carried out, again, by their own ultranationalists. They decided to pin it on the Russians and then to use it against the Russians. And they had at that time a very, very strong, or there were people within the government, within the Ukrainian government, had a strong motivation to pin some sort of atrocity on the Russians. That was, okay, at that time, negotiations were ongoing between the Russians and the Ukrainians. That was over the so-called Istanbul Agreement. That was actually the draft. It was either it was reached or they were about to reach it, when the so-called Bucha massacre occurred. And that was Yeah, I think it was immediately after it, because the reason that the Russians withdrew, it was actually a goodwill gesture, because the Ukrainians and the Westerners say, okay, you want this agreement, this peace agreement between you and Ukraine, which again would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, everything except for Crimea. But, it's not right for you to do this with like a loaded gun to their hand. You have these troops outside of Kiev. So the Russians actually agreed and withdrew. And then immediately after, or not immediately, but days after, we came up with these claims of the Bucha massacre and so on and so forth. And it was used, that was part of, the effort, the successful effort to torpedo the Istanbul Agreement, and which has led us into this war today.
Okay, well, could we make an argument at least that since 2014, there have been democratic elections in Ukraine and they have repeatedly elected pro-European governments? So don't they have that right of self-determination, even if there are some unsavory things on the fringes?
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, to call these free elections is, I think, a misnomer. It's just following the coup in 2014, there became a campaign, a very extensive campaign to suppress, all, let's say, anti-nationalist sentiment. People that are who they didn't necessarily weren't pro-Russian, but at least wanted protection for the Russian language, that kind of thing, wanted to maintain trade links with Russia, which they saw, to their benefit and the benefit of Ukraine. But all these parties that were not, exclusively pro-EU, exclusively nationalist in the ultra-nationalist Banderite sense, got suppressed one after another. I think one of the first ones was actually the Communist Party of Ukraine, but then one after another, they were suppressed. So anyway, were these elections fair? And then, not just the political parties, but television stations, channels, broadcasting systems, one after another that weren't towing the Maidan line, again, were shut down one after another. Then you did have an election in 2019 that Zelensky won, but, it wasn't on a simple pro-EU platform. He was actually pro-Minsk, because remember the Minsk Agreement, that was something that was drawn up, first in 2015, that was supposed to actually, again, preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity, but respect the rights of the people in the East. Something that had been actually approved by the UN Security Council. The signatories were the French, the Germans, the Ukrainians themselves, and the Donbass representatives. I don't think Russia was actually a signatory, but was obviously important to it, and it was very much a part of the process. Zelensky was pro-Minsk and was in favor of better relations with Russia. And it was on that platform that he was elected. But kind of similar in some ways to what happened to Poroshenko before him, once he became elected, he was told often, maybe quietly, but often quite openly, and threatened quite openly that, you're not going to do this. And so, yeah, he changed his tune because, again, the powers that be had become hysterically anti-Russian and really, if not necessarily Banderite, very, very Banderite colored. So this was not something that reflected the will of the people. No, by no means.
Okay, well, let's talk about the will of the people a little bit. I mean, are the Ukrainians, are they, wanting to, don't they have a right to defend their land, that they should, and we should support that if there is an invader, is that what they want? Is it, shouldn't we be helping them if they want to fight?
Well, okay. Yeah. If you actually look at, what's happening, if you were really concerned about the people there in the East where the fighting is taking place, you would want to support them, I would think. And it's clear, we had the referenda, back in 2022, is that where the majorities of those, I understand it's wartime and people have their criticisms, but I think it's actually pretty accurate. Again, based on what we know preceded even the the coup and the launch of the SMO, there's a great deal of sympathy for Russia. And initially, even in the Donbass, before the coup, there was a desire to be part of Ukraine, but a Ukraine that respected them. But after 2014, they increasingly found out that no, we cannot be part of this Ukraine. We even have Timoshenko saying that they want to kill us all. So, who are you going to support? Are you going to support the people, who just want to preserve their, their own way of life, their language, their church, their culture, who have always seen themselves as Russian in one sense and another? Or are you going to support the ultranationalists? That's what it ends up being. It's actually there was a time, again, where those people, they were looking for a solution, but like the Russians were actually looking for a solution where they could stay within Ukraine. But that was taken away from them. And it was taken away from them, again, by these ultranationalists supported by the West, who carried out a coup. Yanukovych was the man that they elected, and he was taken away from them. So in the end, you say, well, what could they do? It'd say, okay, well, really, who invaded whom? This is, again, we decided to just look at everything like history started on February 24th, 2022, but it didn't.
Okay, well, I think for many people, it's when they hear this, it's hard to fully digest it and understand it, because we've been fed a narrative for so long that we've been hating Russia for 10 years, basically ever since Russiagate in at least for the mainstream people. I know that within the establishment, it goes back further. But so how do we know what you're saying is true, contrary to what we've been told over the past 10 years about Russia and its aggressive posture and everything, and the true, I'll let you go.
Okay. Well, one thing I would actually recommend, if you really have your doubts, you have trouble believing it, go to Russia. I have the feeling that, that 90% of the people actually went to Russia and decided to just live a normal, travel around, experience it on different levels. You just find it's not the place. It's implied that somehow it's a country that's falling apart, that it's held together by threats of violence or whatever. It's just nothing like that. There's very little military presence. There's actually, there's not much police presence. You just find a very civilized and prosperous and, overall, just a very, very pleasant, normal, sane place. That's one thing I would do, because I know there's this huge information war, but stop, actually get out of the bubble. Look, if you have discovered that you were lied to about Israel, maybe you were lied to about some other things. Maybe you do have to make an effort and actually listen to the other side. Go listen to a talk given by John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs. And, again, Jeffrey Sachs is in particular, both of these people have studied the place and know it Jeffrey Sachs is very much involved in the history. He was in the room, I guess, with Yeltsin when it was announced that the Soviet Union had fallen. I mean, that's how close he was to all these events. And again, this guy is not some Russian nationalist or anything like that. He's really kind of an old-fashioned leftist is what he is. But he gives a very, very, very convincing argument, a very compassionate argument, about Ukraine. And again, both Mearsheimer and him, they understand what's going on in Israel completely and are, completely on the side of the Palestinians who are suffering there. And now they're completely on the, are very sympathetic, very, very sympathetic with the Russians and understand, why they were pushed into this. So I would say, go listen to them, get a book, that's actually, and sit down and read it, because I think you have to do that. You're going to have to make an honest effort to actually at least give the other side a chance, because the the propaganda against Russia has been, like you say, it's been going on for years, well over a decade. And it has, I think it's affected and really warped people's thinking, even when a lot of it turns out to, like in the case of the Russiagate, all of that stuff ended up just being completely empty. There was nothing to any of it. It was just totally fabricated. But there's so much of it that it's just, people have the sense, well, some of it has to be true, and it ends up coloring their perceptions of Russia. And then, there's been so much demonization of Putin. Again, another thing you can go and was it Oliver Stone had these 4 hours of interviews with Putin. And that was, when did he do that? Was it prior or after the coup? I actually can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was after the coup. But I think you just get a sense of the man, and he's highly intelligent. And actually, if you really, if you make an actual effort to understand what's going on and how the Russians see this, and they honestly see it, as was revealed by that memorandum, you will see that he's actually been very prudent, very cautious. He doesn't go quickly to the military solution. Actually, quite the reverse. He's always trying to look for the diplomatic off-ramp, a way to avoid it. And, a lot of people in Russia, actually, like the majority of people, especially, within the political class, think that he's been too cautious, that he should have been more aggressive. And it's because he's been so cautious, so prudent, so willing to compromise, so willing, has been so patient. Like in the case of the Minsk Agreements, he waited for 8 years when clearly there was no sincerity on the other side to implement it. And then later, again, like the main architects of it, Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko, all of them admitted that the whole thing was a ruse. But you can say very naively, Putin just believed in it, tried to make it work. That's the kind of person that he is. He had this image that has been created of him. It's just so far from the reality. But it's hard to get through that because you just have this sense, you've been consuming this news for, well over a decade. It just seems like this is a reality. This man is just some, Putin, he's hell bent on reestablishing the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. He's maybe deranged and he's bloodthirsty and you think, well, maybe it's somewhat exaggerated, but he's obviously got to be really, really bad. Otherwise, how would, I think sometimes, again, it may be hard to believe how far from the truth that the information is that you have been consuming. But again, if you realized that you had been misled on Israel, you had been hearing for such a long time what a wonderful place Israel was, and so on and so forth, and then you finally found, hey, I have been lied to. You could be lied to about other things. So you got to make that same effort really to go and listen to the other side. And there are a lot of sources, both on the internet, and there are good books that you can read. And if you just make an effort, I assure you, you'll see that you'll start to see what it is, because what the other side says really adds up and is supported by the facts.
What book would you recommend?
Well, actually, I would recommend a book that I am reading right now. That it was published, I think, in 2000. Richard Sakwa, a historian, right? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not showing it to you. There you go. Okay. Yeah, I'll show it to you, but I got to put it in front of my camera. This is Frontline Ukraine. Okay. So this is prior to the SMO, but it gives you the background. And I think, he's quite balanced. If anything, he may be a little bit too harsh on the Russians, but I think he does a marvelous job. And it's just to get a background to the coup. He argues that it's maybe better to call it a revolution, but but you'll have to read it to find out why he says that. An armed insurrection. Anyway, yeah, he's somebody who sticks very closely to the facts and is, just works very, very hard to be as objective as possible. That's one book that I definitely can recommend.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope that if people made it all the way to the end of this conversation, that it's some food for thought and that they can digest. It's hard to switch some type of a narrative that's been so ingrained in your mind. You've had this way of thinking and viewing things, and I understand how difficult it is to try to keep that open mind when you've been conditioned. You may not even be aware that you're conditioned in that sense. But what should we hope for? Maybe it's too much to ask for some people to, start supporting Russia or whatever. But obviously, this is, like we said in the beginning, this is perhaps the most important conflict in our time. This is determining the future of the world. So what should we hope for? What is, when we say the future of the world, can you be a little more specific on what is on the line for us? What is on the line for the average American and the European? How will this affect us? And
Well,
we feel like we have to keep our, the U.S. order, or else it's going to, what's going to happen?
Yeah, well, that's what it is. It's, American-led Western hegemony is on the line, as Boris Johnson himself said. And so, yeah, it is monumentally important. And it has already diminished that hegemony. Again, there has been a change in opinion, not so much within, just to a certain extent, even within the West, but especially outside of the West. Like I think the initial vote condemning the Russian invasion was something like 145, it was an overwhelming majority, in condemnation of the SMO, or the Russian invasion, or the intervention in the Civil War, whatever you want to call it. But the most recent vote, it was down to 93, which is not even a majority within the UN. And it shows that actually global opinion is shifting on this. It most certainly is. It's just that the Russians did a very poor job, and they just don't, it seems so this is not something they invest much effort in, in spite of what the West says. They don't really allocate many resources, to the information war. And they don't work very hard and are maybe not very good at explaining themselves. So like when it happened, I wasn't even really clear as to what was going on. When the SMO was launched, I was actually taken aback. I was surprised by it. But at that point, I knew that I needed to understand, and I began to really make an effort to understand what was going on. And so, my own perceptions actually of the war have changed over time as I understand exactly, what was, you got this image of just a reckless and completely incompetent invasion. Maybe it was foolish, but you say, what are they doing? Are they trying to take over Kiev? And then now they failed. This is what a bunch of incompetence, what's going on? It became clear that they never had any idea of seizing Kiev or all of Ukraine, in spite of the things that are repeated endlessly about them. They went in with just, 100,000 soldiers plus 50,000 militia from Donbass. And it was an effort which they began on the very next day to actually reach a diplomatic solution. And it almost worked. The Ukrainians actually initialed the draft, and the Russians were prepared to pull out everything. But that's something that it's actually come out later. It's just like the Russians, I think, said it, but maybe in all the noise, it was hard to really believe it or whatever. But then there are all kinds of people have come out, actually from the West and other countries who are parties to the negotiations saying, yes, that's what's happened. That's what happened. Anyway, there is perceptions of the war are changing, especially within the global community. And we've seen the rise of the BRICS, and we've seen that, no, Russia is not isolated. It kind of looked like initially they had been, but they're not. And even within the West, there is growing skepticism, and there is much less support for Ukraine than there used to be. It's still there, but it's changing. And I just hope for the sake of, actually, especially of Europe, we could do without Russia. Like our trade links with Russia were never really very significant. But the Europeans really cannot do without Russia. They were very closely tied to the Russian economy. There was both imports and exports, made up a very large share of of a very, very important share of their economies, and they are suffering. They're suffering a lot more than Russia is from this economic war, and I hope that they wake up. I hope they do. But it's not clear that they will.
Yeah. Well, it just sounds like, the Europeans, they are doing their best to lay their groundwork for a war with Russia, a NATO war with Russia. So I hope that this conversation, if people there in Europe are listening to it, can just open your mind and don't fall for this propaganda, because a NATO war with Russia would just be absolutely catastrophic for the world. I mean, and just if you care about Ukraine, the Ukrainian people have been suffering horribly. They want this war to end. Polls show that. We've seen forced conscription. I mean, even during World War II, under Nazi Germany, we didn't have this type of forced conscription where they have armed men go into the people's houses and pull people out of their cars and beat them up and throw them into buses and vans. This needs to end. It's very dangerous. And something it just makes me think is this, we all live in these countries and we all feel like everything is just fine and safe, but can things just switch on a dime? Like if we go into war with a country like Russia, we see these forced conscriptions happening in Ukraine. Could that happen to us? I mean, just the idea of conscription to me is just so insane. That so you can get something in the mail that says you got to go sign up and go to war and fight for some cause that you don't believe in halfway across the world. I just don't. But
Yeah.
We saw what happened to the Ukrainians. People are hiding in basements. I remember getting comments from people saying that they haven't left their home, their basement, in over a year because they're afraid of being forced conscripted. People wear wigs. It's just a nightmare scenario. And you think that you live in a country that can keep you safe from that, but if all war breaks out, could that be coming to all of us? Where men with guns come to our houses and grab people and say you got to go fight?
Yeah. I don't think so. And the reason is that actually, again, the support, I can't speak, maybe it's different for some European countries, especially the Baltic states. But in the U.S., it seems clear to me that the support for Ukraine is, maybe at one time it was a mile wide and an inch deep. Now it's just, a few feet wide and an inch deep. There's really not much support for Ukraine. So if there was an effort by our government to conscript us, I think it would be, it would lead to it would lead to an uprising. I don't think that the Americans would go along with it. And I think that's probably true of a number of the Europeans too. Because again, this is something that it's the political class on both sides of the Atlantic, that they're the ones that are really committed to this, because this is, again, it's about their maintenance of control. Again, they're maintaining their top position within the global hierarchy. That's the way that they see it. And they're not, but the ones who are actually have to do the fighting, the actual people, they just don't find that kind of commitment anywhere close to it. In fact, a great deal of skepticism and even a certain amount of opposition. And so I just don't think they're going to be able to pull it off.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's hope not. Where do you see this war going? Do you see escalation on the horizon? We'll end here after this.
Yeah. Yeah, well, especially recently, you just had the sense, again, the political class is becoming increasingly desperate and reckless. And, we've seen these bizarre so-called, airspace violations, which I can't be completely sure, but I think, especially in the case of Poland, was a false flag, a real effort to spark a greater war. And again, we've talked about this many times. Zelensky, it is in his interest to spark that greater war. And that he's working on it. He's probably, people in his inner circle are scheming and thinking of ways to draw us in. And then unfortunately, we have plenty of leaders in the West that would be willingly drawn in. So there is a real risk. There is a risk. Now, hopefully it just won't go very far, even if it does happen, because I hope, the people just are going to immediately, and resoundingly say no. And that might force the Again, the Western leadership to just drop the whole project. But I think there clearly is, there are people that are scheming and are ready to expand this war, and it could happen at any time.
Okay, it's scary. Well, let's hope that, just these conversations and all these other people having talks like this just can help counterbalance the mainstream narrative and we can avoid war. So, yeah, if you made it to the end, thank you very much. Let's try to just get the truth out there. And yeah, hope we don't. Hope this doesn't spiral out of control because I love Europe and I just feel like it's just getting destroyed via this war, and it could get a lot worse. It could get a lot worse. Let's hope it doesn't happen. All right, thanks a bunch, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.